There are exactly three kinds of people who will keep watching this video. The first kind will click away in the next 30 seconds because what I am about to say will feel too real, too precise, too uncomfortably close to something they have been avoiding. The second kind will stay but keep one foot out the door, half present, half scrolling, protecting themselves from something they cannot name. And the third kind, the kind I made this for, will feel something shift in their chest the moment I say this next sentence, and they will not be able to look away. Tonight is not a coincidence. Not the algorithm, not a random recommendation, not dumb luck that your thumb stopped here instead of somewhere else. There is a specific reason that out of everything competing for your attention right now, this title found you. This exact title, the monad, activates tonight. And if some part of you already knows what that means, not intellectually, not because you studied it, but because something in your body recognized those words before your mind had time to evaluate them, then you are exactly who this is for, and I need you to stay with me because what happens in the next few minutes cannot be undone. Here is what I want you to understand before anything else. You have been given one window, not a metaphor. A literal, precise, cosmically timed window in the architecture of your own consciousness where the activation that ancient mystery schools spent lifetimes preparing their initiates for becomes available to you in the space of a single transmission. The philosophers who first mapped this called it the threshold, the alchemists called it the moment of readiness, and every single tradition that ever touched this knowledge agreed on one thing. When the window opens, you either step through it or it closes. Not forever, but for long enough that the version of you standing on the other side of tonight looks nothing like the version currently sitting where you are sitting right now. So before we go one word further, if your gut already told you this is real, subscribe to this channel right now, because these transmissions do not repeat themselves and the next one builds directly on what activates tonight. The button is there. Hit it, then come back, because we are just getting started, and where we are going next will change the way you understand every difficult thing that has ever happened to you. There is a concept so ancient that the philosophers who first articulated it were working from traditions that were already considered old in their time. A concept so precise that it survived the collapse of entire civilizations was hidden inside alchemical symbols, encoded in mathematical ratios, whispered through mystery schools that only admitted those who had demonstrated genuine readiness. Not knowledge, readiness. The concept is the monad. And before you decide whether that word means anything to you, I want to tell you what it is not. It is not a spiritual trend. It is not a manifestation technique. It is not a belief system you adopt. The monad is a description of what you already are beneath every story you have been told about yourself and beneath every story you have told yourself. It is the part of you that existed before this name, before this body, before this particular arrangement of experiences that you call your history. It is the indestructible, indivisible, self-sufficient core of your consciousness. And the reason most people never encounter it is not because it is hidden. It is because everything in the modern world is designed, intentionally or not, to keep your attention permanently fixed on the outer layers so that the center remains untouched and unrecognized. Now I want you to do something unusual for a moment. I want you to think about the version of you that exists right now, reading these words, watching this transmission, not who you were 5 years ago, not who you hope to become. Right now, and I want you to notice something specific about that version of you. There is a part of you that is watching your own life the way a person watches a film, slightly removed, observing, aware of the drama without being completely dissolved into it. That part, the observer, the witness, the awareness that is aware of your own awareness, that is what the ancient philosophers were pointing at when they used the word monad, not a philosophical concept, not a spiritual achievement, the most fundamental, irreducible fact of your own existence. The part of you that was present when you were 5 years old and is present right now and will be present in forms you cannot currently imagine long after this particular chapter of your story concludes. The 3rd century philosopher Plotinus, who stands at the absolute summit of the Neoplatonic tradition and who spent his entire intellectual life mapping the architecture of consciousness with a precision that modern neuroscience is only beginning to catch up with, described the journey of the soul as a circular movement. not linear, not progressive in the way we typically imagine progress, circular. The soul emanates from the one, the source, what he called the monad, descends into the full experience of multiplicity and form and matter and separation, gathers everything that experience has to offer, and then begins the return, the epistrophe, the great turning back toward its own origin. And here is what Plotinus understood that almost no contemporary spiritual teacher talks about directly. The return is not a journey toward something you have never been. The return is a journey towards something you have always been and temporarily forgot. The monad is not a destination. It is a recognition. The difference between those two things is the difference between spending your entire life climbing a mountain and realizing at the summit that you never left home. Leibniz, the 17th century mathematician and philosopher who independently invented calculus and whose philosophical system was so complex and so precise that scholars are still unpacking its implications today, described each monad as a simple substance without windows. Read that phrase carefully. Without windows, meaning it does not receive its reality from outside itself. It does not depend on external circumstances to determine its nature. It does not require validation from other monads to know what it is. The monad is completely self-sufficient. It reflects within itself, Leibniz wrote, the totality of the universe from its own unique and irreplaceable perspective. You are not a fragment of something larger waiting to be reunited with a whole that exists outside of you. You are the whole operating at a specific coordinate, expressing itself through the lens of your particular and irreplaceable consciousness. Every person who has ever made you feel small, every circumstance that has ever convinced you that you were lacking something essential, every wound that taught you to make yourself less, was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of what you are. Not a harsh judgment of those people or those circumstances. Simply a fact about the level of reality they were operating from. And this is where it gets personal, because I am not talking about philosophy as an intellectual exercise. I am talking about the direct, lived experience of the gap between who you actually are and who you have been performing. You know that gap. You have felt it in the middle of conversations where you said the expected thing instead of the true thing. You have felt it in the moments after achievements that were supposed to feel like a rival, but felt instead like a subtle but unmistakable emptiness. You have felt it in relationships where you were loved for the version of yourself you presented rather than the version of yourself you actually inhabit when no one is watching. That gap is not evidence of your brokenness. That gap is the space between the monad and the dyad, between what you are and what you have been convinced you are. And the awareness of that gap, the sensitivity to that gap, the refusal to stop feeling that gap, even when every comfortable option would have had you ignore it, that is not a problem. That is the signal. That is the readiness announcing itself. The Pythagoreans, who understood that number and vibration are not abstract mathematical concepts, but the literal language through which consciousness organizes itself into form, had a specific framework for understanding this dynamic. The monad represented unity, wholeness, self-sufficiency, the principle of the one from which all multiplicity proceeds. The dyad represented division, duality, the principle of separation through which the one comes to know itself through the experience of contrast. Most human beings, operating from the level of ordinary conditioned consciousness, live their entire lives within the dyad, experiencing themselves as fragments, in competition with other fragments, seeking outside themselves for what can only be discovered within, building identities from comparison and fear and the accumulated scar tissue of a soul that has been told in 1,000 different ways across 1,000 different moments that it is not enough. The dyad is not a mistake. It is a stage, a necessary stage, a stage through which every soul must pass in order to gather the experience of separation that makes the recognition of unity possible. You cannot truly know wholeness without having genuinely experienced fragmentation. You cannot truly recognize home without having genuinely felt the experience of exile. The wandering is not a detour from the journey. The wandering is the journey. And the question is not whether you have wandered. The question is whether you are ready to recognize that the wandering has served its purpose, whether you are ready to stop searching for a destination and recognize the territory you are already standing on. Think about the specific texture of your life right now. not the surface-level circumstances, but the felt quality of your experience. There is likely an intensity to this period that does not fit neatly into the categories of good or bad. Things may be collapsing and emerging simultaneously. Old structures that once felt stable are showing their cracks. Certainties that you organized your life around are becoming questions. And alongside that dissolution, something else is happening. Something quieter, harder to name. A quality of awareness that is beginning to notice itself. A stillness that appears in unexpected moments beneath the noise of your circumstances. A knowing that doesn't speak in words but communicates through a sense of recognition when you encounter certain ideas, certain people, certain transmissions that reach something in you that ordinary content never touches. This combination, the simultaneous collapse of the old and the quiet emergence of the new, is not chaos. The ancient texts had a name for it. They called it the alchemical fire. The nigrido, the blackening, the necessary dissolution of everything that was constructed from the outside in, so that what was always present from the inside out can finally become visible. The alchemists were not chemists with a primitive understanding of metallurgy. They were philosophers of consciousness using the language of matter to describe the transformation of the soul. When they spoke of transmuting lead into gold, they were describing the precise process you are currently living through. The lead is the dyad identity, the accumulated weight of every wound, every false belief, every performance, every version of yourself you constructed to survive environments that could not hold your actual nature. The gold is the monad, not something you create, something you uncover. The alchemical fire does not add anything to the lead to make it gold. It burns away everything that was obscuring the gold that was always present beneath the surface. Your current experience of dissolution, of things falling away, of identities that once felt solid becoming uncertain, is not destruction. It is refining. It is the fire doing exactly what fire is supposed to do. And the fact that you are still here, still present, still willing to sit with the intensity of this period rather than escape into distraction, is itself evidence that something in you recognizes the fire as necessary, as purposeful, as the specific kind of burning that produces something irreplaceable. Helena Blavatsky, drawing on the deepest currents of theosophical tradition and synthesizing material from sources most Western scholars had never encountered, described the monad as the eternal pilgrim. The triad of Atma, Buddhai and Manas, spiritual will, divine intuition and higher mind. The immortal core that traverses ages and incarnations, wearing body after body, personality after personality, gathering experience and refining its expression through the full spectrum of existence in the world of form. Your current personality, the name you answer to, the face you see in the mirror, the history you carry, is one expression of this eternal traveler, one particular and unrepeatable performance of a consciousness that has been performing across more time than your current personality can comfortably hold. And the moment you begin to feel this, not as a belief, but as a direct recognition, something fundamental shifts in how you relate to your own history. Every difficulty you have faced begins to look different, not less real, not less painful, different, more purposeful, more precise. The crises that brought you to your knees look less like punishments and more like calibrations. The losses that rewrote the map of your reality look less like accidents and more like necessary. Destructions of maps that were too small for the territory you were being prepared to navigate. The encounters that broke you open look less like wounds and more like initiations. You were not being damaged, you were being prepared, and the preparation was not random. It was specific to the exact qualities, capacities, and depths of awareness that this moment in your evolution requires. There is a story from the ancient world that the Neoplatonists used to illuminate this dynamic. A vast and timeless library exists at a level of reality that underlies all physical reality, not a metaphor, a description of the architecture of consciousness itself. In this library, there is a record for every soul that has ever existed, not a record of their accomplishments or their failures, a record of their frequency, their unique vibrational signature, the irreducible pattern of consciousness that makes them precisely and only themselves. A soul arrives at this library after a long journey, many lifetimes worth of wandering through the world of form. He has been a student and a teacher, a warrior and a healer, a servant and a sovereign. He has experienced the full spectrum of what existence in the dyad feels like. And now he stands at the entrance of the library, not because he decided to come here, but because something in him, some deep and wordless current of knowing, led him to this door without his being able to explain why. The keeper of the library looks up and recognizes him immediately, not with surprise, with the particular quality of recognition that belongs to something that was always inevitable. She reaches into a section of the library that the soul cannot see from where he stands and places a single volume on the table before him. He opens it. The first page contains only his name in a script he has never studied but can read perfectly, and beneath his name a single sentence. You are not a fragment seeking wholeness. You are wholeness learning to remember itself. He sits with that sentence for what feels like a very long time, and then something releases in him that he did not know he was holding. Not a tension he created consciously, but a tension that had been present so long it had become indistinguishable from his sense of what it felt like to exist. The searching stops, not because he found what he was looking for outside himself, because he recognized that the searching and the searcher and the sought were always the same thing. The library was never external. He was always the library. You are both the soul in that story and the library. You are both the pilgrim and the destination. Part of you has been traveling so long that the traveling has become your identity. Part of you has been searching so persistently that the searching has become more familiar than stillness. But the destination was never somewhere else. The home you have been moving toward across all this wandering is not a place you arrive at. It is a recognition that occurs in a specific kind of stillness. And that stillness is available to you right now, beneath the noise of your circumstances, beneath the commentary of your conditioned mind, beneath the accumulated weight of your history and your hopes and your fears and your carefully constructed identity. It is there. It has always been there, and the way to it is not through achievement or accumulation or the resolution of every outstanding question in your life. The way to it is through a specific quality of turning, not outward toward the next stimulus or the next answer or the next version of yourself you are trying to become. Inward, through the layers, through the thoughts to the awareness behind the thoughts, through the emotions to the awareness behind the emotions, through the story to the stillness that was present before the story began and will remain present after the story concludes. Place your attention at the center of your chest right now, not your heart in the medical sense. The energetic center of your chest that every wisdom tradition across every culture, across every era of recorded human history, has identified as the seat of the deepest self. Bring your awareness there without forcing anything, without trying to feel something specific, without performing an inner experience for an audience, just attention, directed inward, toward the center. Now, instead of directing that attention toward any particular thought or sensation or emotion, turn it around. Point it at the awareness itself, the awareness that is noticing the sensations, the awareness that is watching the thoughts, the awareness that exists prior to everything you are currently experiencing. That pure, contentless, boundless awareness that does not belong to any story and does not require any circumstance to be different than it is. That is the monad, that is you, not the performance, not the personality, not the accumulation of experiences you call your biography. The awareness itself, prior to all of it, present through all of it, unchanged by any of it. Rest there for a moment. Even if the thoughts immediately return, even if the emotions immediately reassert themselves, even if the ordinary mind begins its habitual commentary within seconds of your attempting to be still, rest there even briefly, because every moment of genuine contact with that still point is a moment of genuine contact with your own essential nature, and those moments accumulate. They change the architecture of your consciousness, not dramatically, not all at once, but precisely and irreversibly in the direction of remembrance. This is not a meditation technique. This is not a practice you do for 30 days and then evaluate whether it is working. This is the beginning of a fundamental reorientation of your relationship with your own awareness. The ancient mystery schools, the Pythagorean brotherhoods, the Neoplatonic academies, the alchemical lodges of medieval Europe, the theosophical adepts who mapped the journey of the eternal pilgrim, all of them were ultimately pointing at the same reorientation, not a new belief system, Not a new identity, a recognition. The recognition of what you have always been beneath every identity you have ever inhabited. And this recognition, once genuinely touched, changes things. Not in the way a new idea changes things where you understand something differently but your experience remains the same. In the way a light changes a room, the room is the same room. The furniture is in the same places. The dimensions are unchanged, but the experience of the room is entirely transformed because now you can see it. The recognition of the monad does not change your circumstances. It changes the level of reality from which you encounter your circumstances. And when the level changes, everything changes, not because the external world has been rearranged, but because the internal architecture has been fundamentally reoriented. Leibniz described this through his principle of pre-established harmony. Each monad, he wrote, acts in perfect synchronicity with all others, not through direct causal connection, but because they all follow the same underlying intelligence. The universe is not a collection of separate entities bumping into each other randomly. It is a coherent field of consciousness expressing itself through an infinite number of unique perspectives, all of which are in perfect coordination at a level of reality that the surface mind cannot perceive. What feels like coincidence from the level of the dyad, from the level of the fragmented identity that experiences itself as separate and isolated and subject to random fortune, looks entirely different from the level of the monad. From that level, the encounter that seemed random carried exactly the information you needed at exactly the moment you were capable of receiving it. The door that opened at exactly the moment you stopped forcing it opened because your frequency had finally aligned with the frequency of the opening. The person who appeared at precisely the right moment appeared because the coherence of your own deepest nature sent a signal through the field, and the field responded with its characteristic precision. This is not magical thinking. This is the mechanics of a coherent universe operating through a consciousness that has begun to remember its own nature. Synchronicities do not increase because you have learned a manifestation technique. They increase because you have begun to inhabit a level of reality where coherence is visible that was always present but invisible from the level of fragmentation. And here is what this means practically for the life you are living right now. The relationships that no longer resonate, the environments that feel increasingly misaligned, the paths that once seemed obvious but now feel constraining, these are not problems to be solved. They are information. They are the field telling you that your frequency has shifted beyond the range where those things can continue to feel like home. Not because those things are bad, because you have outgrown the frequency at which they operate. The monad does not require you to forcibly remove anything from your life. It only requires you to become honest about what is actually in resonance with your deepest nature and what is being held in place by habit, or fear, or the understandable human reluctance to let go of the familiar even when the familiar has stopped serving your actual evolution. Resonance is information. Dissonance is also information. And a consciousness that is beginning to operate from its monadic nature becomes exquisitely sensitive to the difference between the two, not in a way that produces constant dissatisfaction with everything that is not perfect, in a way that produces clarity. The clear, quiet, unargumentative knowing that this aligns and this does not, and the willingness growing gradually and then suddenly to let that knowing be the compass. There is something the ancient texts described as the death of the false self, and they were not being dramatic or poetic when they used that word. The dissolution of the dyad identity, the constructed, fear-based, externally dependent version of yourself that was assembled brick by brick from other people's expectations and the adaptive strategies of a consciousness navigating environments that could not fully hold it, genuinely feels like a kind of death while it is happening. Not because you are dying, because the identity that attached itself to the fragmented self experiences any threat to its continuity as existential. The ego does not distinguish between its own dissolution and the dissolution of the organism it serves. To the conditioned mind, the death of the false self and actual death feel indistinguishable in terms of the fear they generate. This is why the ancient texts describe the initiation process as terrifying, not because the teachers wanted it to be, because the crossing of the threshold between dyad consciousness and monadic consciousness requires passing through the precise experience of not knowing who you are, the vertigo of the liminal space. the space between the identity you were and the recognition of what you actually are. And most people, the moment they begin to feel that vertigo, immediately reach for something familiar. Some identity, some narrative, some role or relationship or achievement to grab onto and reorient around. The initiation fails not because the person lacked intelligence or sincerity, but because the fear of not knowing was greater than the trust in what lies on the other side of not knowing. The oyster does not choose to make the pearl. An irritant enters its shell, something that disrupts the comfortable equilibrium of its ordinary existence, something that it cannot ignore and cannot expel. And rather than being destroyed by the disruption, the oyster does something extraordinary. It responds to the irritant not with resistance but with a different kind of engagement. Layer by layer, it surrounds the source of its discomfort with something luminous. The pearl is not the removal of the irritation. The pearl is the transformation of the irritation into something of rare and irreplaceable beauty. Your discomfort is the irritant. Your awakening is the pearl. The pressure you are currently under is not crushing you. It is creating the conditions for something that could not have been created any other way. The Plotinian concept of epistrophe, the great return, is not about going back to something you lost. It is about recognizing something that was never actually absent. The monad did not go anywhere when the soul descended into the experience of multiplicity and separation. It remained exactly where it always was, at the center, at the still point, at the place that Plotinus described as the axis around which all of experience turns without itself turning. The return is not a reversal of the outward journey. It is the recognition that the outward journey was always taking place within the stillness of the monad, that the separation was always occurring within the unity, that the searching was always taking place within the found, that the exile was always happening within the home. And when this recognition occurs, not as a philosophical understanding but as a direct, immediate, unmediated experience of your own awareness, the whole architecture of your experience reorganizes itself. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic moment of transformation, though there are such moments. Gradually and then suddenly, the way ice melts, nothing happening for a long time and then the whole structure changing state. There is a specific quality of awareness that begins to emerge as the monadic recognition deepens. The ancient traditions had many names for it. The Theosophists called it Buddhai, divine intuition. The Neoplatonists called it nous, pure intellect. The alchemists called it the philosopher's stone. In contemporary language, we might call it a kind of knowing that operates prior to reasoning, prior to analysis, prior to the sequential processing of information that the conditioned mind engages in when it is trying to figure something out. This knowing does not arrive as a conclusion at the end of a logical chain. It arrives as a recognition at the beginning of an encounter, before the mind has had time to evaluate, before the social programming has had time to insert its preferences. A direct, immediate, unmediated contact with the truth of a situation that is available precisely because the monadic awareness does not filter reality through the accumulated projections of a fragmented identity. It sees what is actually there rather than what the conditioned self needs to be there. This is what the ancient traditions meant by wisdom as distinct from intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to process information effectively within a given framework. Wisdom is the capacity to perceive the actual nature of a situation prior to any framework, and wisdom in this specific sense is not an achievement. It is not something you develop through study or accumulate through experience, though both of those things can serve it. It is what becomes available when the noise of the dyad identity quiets enough for the signal of the monad to be heard. Your intuition is not a mysterious and unreliable faculty that occasionally produces interesting hunches. Your intuition is the monad communicating with the personality through the only channel that bypasses the conditioned mind. And the reason most people have a complicated relationship with their own intuition, trusting it selectively, doubting it systematically, dismissing it when it conflicts with what they want or what seems socially acceptable, is precisely because the dyad identity experiences the monadic signal as a threat to its own authority. The conditioned mind wants to be the primary decision-making faculty. It wants to evaluate, analyze, compare, and conclude. The monadic knowing does not participate in that process. It simply knows. And a consciousness that is learning to operate from its monadic nature must at some point make the choice to honor the knowing even when it cannot yet fully explain it. Not blindly, not in a way that bypasses discernment, but genuinely, with the recognition that the deepest knowing available to you is not located in the part of your consciousness that can be argued with. It is located in the part that has never needed to argue because it has never been in doubt. This is where everything practical converges. The recognition of the monad is not a spiritual experience you have and then return from to your ordinary life unchanged. The recognition of the monad is the beginning of a fundamental reorientation of how you make decisions, how you navigate relationships, how you understand your own history and your own purpose, how you experience the full spectrum of being human. From this reorientation, not from the performance of spiritual practices or the adoption of particular beliefs or the construction of a new and better identity, but from the genuine recognition of your own deepest nature, everything else follows. Not as a series of techniques to be applied, as natural consequences of alignment. The way a tuning fork produces sound not because it is trying to produce sound, but because that is what a tuning fork aligned with its own frequency does. You do not have to figure out how to radiate the monadic frequency. You only have to stop doing the things that obscure it, stop performing, stop pretending, stop carrying identities that belong to other people's projections. Stop arguing with your own knowing in order to appear more reasonable to people who are still operating from the level of fragmentation. Stop making yourself small in rooms that cannot hold your actual dimensions, not aggressively, not dramatically, quietly, honestly, with the particular quality of self-respect that belongs to a consciousness that has touched its own indestructible nature and knows, not as a belief but as a lived recognition, that the indestructible nature does not require protection or performance or the approval of other fragments. It only requires recognition. The halo that the ancient traditions described around the heads of those who had undergone genuine transformation was not a supernatural phenomenon reserved for a specific category of exceptional beings. It was a description of something real and observable, the quality of presence that emanates from a consciousness that has recognized its own monadic nature, a presence that does not need to assert itself because it simply is. A radiance that is not performed because it is not a technique. It is what happens when the internal architecture of a consciousness reorganizes itself around the still point rather than around the fragmented identity. People feel it before they can explain it. Rooms change when someone who carries it enters them. Conversations reach depths that they would not otherwise reach. Possibilities appear that were not previously visible, not because of anything the person does, because of what they are operating from. This is the halo, not an achievement, a natural consequence of genuine alignment, and it is available to you, not as a distant aspiration. As the natural result of a recognition that is already occurring within you as you sit with this transmission. The activation of the monad is irreversible, not in a frightening sense, but in the sense that once you have genuinely touched the still point, even once, even briefly, even imperfectly, you cannot fully return to the belief that you are only the fragment. You cannot genuinely return to the conviction that the wound is the whole story. Something has been seen that cannot be unseen. Some layer of the performance has become transparent that cannot become opaque again. And this irreversibility is not a burden. It is a liberation, because it means that every subsequent moment of forgetting, every subsequent collapse back into dired consciousness, every subsequent identification with the fragmented self that will absolutely occur because you are a human being navigating a complex world, every one of those moments now has a reference point, a memory of the still point, a knowing, however faint, however temporary, that the fragmented experience is not the final word on what you are. And that knowing, that reference point, that memory of the monad is the most important thing you can carry through your life, not because it solves your problems, because it changes the ground from which you encounter them. When the chaos reasserts itself, and it will, when the dired identity reasserts its grip, and it will, when the circumstances of your life produce exactly the kind of pressure that makes the still point seem impossibly distant, this is what you return to. Not a technique, not a ritual, not a prescribed sequence of steps. 3 words, said inwardly, said with your whole being rather than just your voice. Said not as an affirmation you are trying to convince yourself of, but as a remembrance, a return, the simplest possible gesture toward the center. I am home. Not because your circumstances are resolved, not because the pain has stopped, not because the questions have been answered, because the awareness that is aware of the pain, the awareness that holds the questions, the awareness that witnesses the circumstances is itself the home, and the home was never lost, only temporarily forgotten. I am home is not a claim about your circumstances, it is a recognition of your nature. And every time you return to it, even briefly, even in the middle of difficulty, even when everything around you is insisting that you are the fragment and the fragment is all there is, you are strengthening the muscle of remembrance. You are deepening the groove of recognition. You are making the return, the great epistrophe, the journey back to your own origin, more and more your natural default state. This is the map the ancient alchemists encoded in their symbols. This is the philosopher's stone. This is the transmutation of lead into gold, not the construction of a better identity from more refined materials. The recognition through and beneath all your materials of the awareness that has never required refinement because it has never been diminished. The awareness that predates your wounds and will outlast your healing. The awareness that exists prior to your questions and will remain present after every answer. The awareness that is the monad, the still point, the one, the home. You are not a fragment seeking wholeness. You have never been a fragment. You are wholeness that temporarily forgot itself in the rich and necessary and ultimately purposeful experience of fragmentation. And tonight in this transmission, in the particular quality of attention you have brought to these words, something has shifted, not metaphorically. In the actual architecture of your consciousness, a layer has thinned, a channel has opened, a signal that has always been present has become slightly more audible, and that slight increase in audibility is not nothing. That slight increase in audibility is the beginning of everything. Welcome home.